Today we're out on one of the last days of December 2025, and I want to talk about a principle in ecology called baselines and baseline shifts. A baseline is a line that you lay down to measure how things change, or to measure distances, or to produce other measurements that you can't measure directly necessarily. If you think about if you're doing some engineering, you're making something which is fairly complicated and requires lots of different measurements to get all the components right. If you're drawing it out especially, you start from a single point, which is called a datum. If you measure everything from that single point, you don't get into issues with lots of different measurements, one to the next one, to the next one, to the next one. All those different measurements, each having an error, and all those errors adding up. Say you've got 0.01% error in each measurement, and if you've got 15 measurements from point A to point B to point C to point D to point E or whatever, by the time you get to point J or whatever, your potential errors have added up. But if you measure everything from point A, then from point A to point C, point A to point D, even if those are all in a line, then each of those single measurements has got the same error, and your errors don't mount. That's the same with a baseline. If I wanted to measure something on the other side of this road, say this was a canyon, I couldn't get over there, and I had a tape measure, and I had something to find different angles, could lay down my baseline, get that precise, and I can measure that object, say that lamppost, from each end of my baseline, get these angles correct, and I could use mathematics, which I don't normally use, to find out the distance to there without physically having to go there and laying down a tape measure, or doing it some other way. Anyway, when I grew up here, all on this side of the road, there were no houses. There were a few houses on this side of the road, and they were all a lot smaller than they are now. This one here is smaller than some of the others because they've all been extended. When I first came up here, I suppose it was about 1968 or 1969, I would have been 5 or 6. I came up with my dad. You can see here there's a small house which has got a lot bigger. I remember coming up here and anyway, I came up here with my dad, and I remember standing on the side of this road, and they just put this road in, and they just put the curbs in and the pavement. And literally you could step off the pavement on this side and look down this hill, and all stretching through here was heathland. Closer to the road there was dump material, there's garden cuttings and oil drums and piles of refuse. But as you went further away down this slope, it was all heathland. This is Craigside Road, which was the first bit of this development they did, and this was called the Craigside Estate. And this was known as Racecourse Heath. Not that you ever know this from walking around here now or driving around here now, because this is no longer heathland, even in most people's memories. And all around here there was a lot of heath. But the point is, to measure change in ecology, you need a point to start from to measure that change. You need a baseline. And if your baseline is incorrect, if there's errors in your baseline, then that makes your measurement of change in your habitat or habitats or your ecosystem incorrect or wrong or subjective. So baselines are incredibly important. And as I get older, I start to realise that my personal baseline is a lot different from those of much younger people. It ain't their fault, it's just the differences in experience. And those differences can be cumulative. When they get to my age, and they look on younger people again, equivalent age to what they are now, then the baselines of those younger people will be different again, and very different from my baseline. So all this, when you walk down here, once upon a time, I remember walking where I'm walking now, would have been heathland. And I remember the heather, and I remember the heat, because we came up in early summer. And I remember the lichen and the sundews, because my dad showed me the sundews. And I remember the lichen crunching underneath my feet. But all that's long gone. They kept some of the trees, and they planted more. But the heathland itself, yeah, that's gone. This is kind of what it used to look like. See, this is all wet heath. But if you subtract most of the scrub and make these Scots pine trees about half the size they are now, you kind of get the picture. And this is the end of the development that went in. You can see the houses on the edge. And along the back of those houses, there's a tributary to the Moors River. And we used to come up here. This is Ringwood, and I used to play up here. I used to play on my own, sometimes with friends. You could walk through there, all the way over onto the farmland, down to the Moors River. And on here you could see in the summer and catch lizards, which are rather nice, especially the bright green ones. And you could see these rather strident little birds singing in the top of the gorse bushes. And the gorse bushes then were a lot fewer and smaller than they are now. Those of course were Dartford warblers, and the lizards, of course, I now know, were sand lizards. Didn't know that then. They were nice lizards. Down in that stream over there, you could catch newts. Two different sorts of newts at least. And in the summer you could see them with their breeding colours, and they were quite nice. And over on this side of the track, you had what was dry heath, and this was devoid of trees. There were just a few very small ones. No holly trees like that one over there at all. And it was tall heather and hardly any gorse. And this in the summer was extremely dry. You could walk over here and it would be stinking hot. And over there, you can see where the trees are. There were trees. And they were Scots pines as they are now. And they didn't come over this far. All these young ones here were not there. So if you come over here now and you didn't know it all those years ago, you would think that this has always been like this, and that this habitat is in a stable state. It is managed towards it being a stable state by these people. Note Nature Reserve and Site of Special Scientific Interest. But it is not in itself in a stable state. It is slowly going from open heathland more towards scrub and woodland. So your baseline comes in when you think how to manage that change. Is that change a good thing or is it a bad thing? Will it get to a certain stage and then the species for which it is managed, including the sand lizards, start to decline and then become extinct? This area here is very dubiously linked to this area over here. So this is an island of heathland, and that's an island of heathland. When I first knew it, This track here was much less well defined. It was mainly sand and natural sands and natural gravels, and all this area over here was heathland. This was a much bigger area, and the carrying capacity was much bigger, and it was arguably a lot more resilient from the point of view of, say, sand lizards and common lizards and other herpetiles to them becoming extinct. Small islands generally carry less species than large islands and are more prone to a cataclysmic event, making a population of an animal extinct or drastically threatening it. One big fire coming up through here early in the season, jumping this track and going through here could potentially put pay to the lot of this. So this is Lyons Hill. Of course, because this is my personal baseline and I'm telling you my memories, I've got no way of objectively proving what I'm telling you. I have no photographs, we had no cameras. Well, my dad had a camera, but it only came out for very special occasions. I've certainly got no photographs, I've got no video dated from then. But over there, there's a pair of birches, which were probably here as young trees when this development started. And just here, look, we've got a little tiny patch of heather struggling on this bank, where it's just been mowed and mowed and mowed. But we've certainly got ling. This is the most common of the heathers, and a little bit of black sedge, Carex nigra. But that's just sitting there as a last little ghost of what used to be here, which used to be SSSI-quality heathland, which has now been gone for getting on for half a century. If I had species lists from this site, I'm not saying they don't exist, I don't have them, other people may have them, that would go some way to saying what has been lost and to measuring decline in heathland. For instance, the wildlife trusts, that's the words I'm looking for, the wildlife trusts did a State of the Nation report, I think it was in 2013, which set out how much heathland has been lost since 1800, and they reckoned it was 80%. But of course that depends how you're measuring the heathland. There's more heathland than that been lost, or less. Was it only counting big bits? Was it only counting bits of heathland that were somehow recorded as heathland? Were there other bits that went unrecorded and have since been lost? We don't know, and this speaks to accuracy of baselines. Over there is that little patch of ling, and on this verge we've got another little echo, little patch of bell heather. This is definitely bell heather. Don't know whether the GoPro will pick that up. Faint little ringing, there are still some seeds in these capsules. That's Erica cinerea. Neither that nor the ling over the other side would have been planted. It's just sort of hung on here, being mowed frequently in this sort of poor sandy soil, which originally would have been a podsol. We won't go into podsols here. P-O-D-S-O-L. If you're interested, you can look that up, because that is a heath and soil, lowland heath. And lowland heath is different from moors, but moors and heaths in some areas are interchangeable in the vernacular. So here we are in St Leonards, on the boundary with Ashley Heath, and further over that way there is West Moors. So these again are echoes of the heathland that was previously here. The heathland which is now gone, now vanished. 99% gone under houses and conifers and similar. This is called Bracken Close, or Fernley Close. And I remember when this was all heathland as well. These houses weren't here. In fact, I remember these houses actually starting to go up. In those days, you didn't have big hoardings around sites. You could just wander in as a kid and have a look around and sort through the fill inside the walls underneath where the floors were going to go. You could find fossils in there because it was all chert rejects. But if you look here, we've got more ling, because this is all very poor soil, all very sandy, and all through here, more ling. This is all remembrances of the heathland that was here. This is just stopping at random. I've not been here before since the houses went up. And over here, look, you've got lots and lots and lots of heather, and here you've got one of the dwarf gorses, again a heathland specialist, all preserved by mowing. So if someone would come along here and say, buy this house, I think, yeah, this is really scrappy, this is really shitty, let's put some feed and green on this and turn it into proper grass, then that little echo goes. And also any biodiversity value that this still retains, because it will retain biodiversity value even if you plant laurels on it. That's cherry laurel. And over here in the lee of these shrubs you got some planted heather. This is all ling again. Is it planted? Or is it just grown up from what was here before? And some cotoneaster in there. But there's still a possibility of things that rely on heather using that. Mulling through here. Some gorse, just kept short by the mowing. Just ticks along. Probably never flowers because it's kept too small. And more ling. And lots of different mosses. And more ling. And bell heather. And every so often, statutory undertakers come along, dig stuff up, and then seed it for grasses. Whereas if they just left it, then the heather and the dwarf gorse will get a chance. And if you've got a wet bit of verge, would you get sundews? Don't know. What's going to happen in the long term? What are the chances for some wildlife gardening? Instead of having your lawns green like this one over here, which they've obviously put some effort into, just let it go more like this grass over here and get more heather. Will that give you more heathland species? Of course on here there's no fucking chance whatsoever. Got what looks like resin bound gravel, and then gravel on the driveway, which looks as though it might be metamorphic rock, which might be calcareous, which is going to change the soil pH and change it away from the heathers. But this house here has planted heathers, probably because there's a gardener lives here and they know about soil types and pHs. They know that heathers will do nicely. So it's just stuff to think about when you're wandering about the place, looking around you. Be prepared for little surprises. Keep your eyes open, keep your mind open, and if you've got the time, go and have a look back in various records and see if you can find that there's been a previous baseline set down by someone which would indicate that the habitat that you're in, and even if you're a human and you live in one of these houses, this is your habitat. And a previous baseline would indicate that the habitat that you're in has been different and could be different in the future. Could be less anodyne. Don't necessarily go with what's on Gardener's Question Time or any of the gardening programmes on the BBC. Inquire and keep your mind open. Because if you go and just mow what you've got, there's a nice sedge there, look. Something interesting might show up in your scrappy, non-green, non-stripy lawn, and it might be something really nice. Right, this is literally just around the corner again, and again more heather. It's all through here. You've got more ling. We've got to know the name of this moss. This again, it's a heath and moss, all amongst the roots of this tree. And you've got little bits of lichen, ground living lichen, and bell heather, and more ling. Polytrichum. It's in my head somewhere. And over here, there's more heathland all the way through, more heather. And a dwarfed cotoneaster, dwarfed by the mowing, I think that is. And over here, and if you just drove past this, you think, yeah, this was all boring grassland, but this was still qualified as grass heath. You've got all these grasses here, which are definitely not ryegrass. And you've got 2 or 3 different species at least, mosses in amongst the bases of them. But here you've got statutory undertakers have come in, possibly for foam. Let's go and find out. I'll double this up. Wessex Internet, is it? Does that say? Anyway, they've come in and dug that up, and they've reinstated, and they basically put the dirt back in, made it more or less flat, and then sown imported grasses on it. And you see how different it is? So little by little, all this ghost habitat, this echo habitat, is changing time after time. This has all still got heather and stuff in it, which is all groovy. I'm over here. Someone's taking care of this little patch of grass. And this is what sort of weed and green and stuff does. And you can see that the vegetation has changed completely. It's all green. Stats have been in again. Doesn't show up so green because you haven't got the contrast. And the habitat's changing. So little by little, habitat changes unless you have a baseline. You can't measure it. Here's a little bit with some sedges in it, which has survived. Oh, look. There's a little tiny bit of very, very dwarfed ling. So that's the story I wanted to say today. On this gloomy day right at the end of 2025. So you need a baseline to measure from. If you haven't got a baseline, you can't come along and say your habitat is what it is and it's been like that forever. Because all habitats are plastic, all habitats change. And without a baseline, you can't measure that change. The baseline can be simple. It can be putting your camera on one of these and taking a photograph of this now, in 5 years, and in 10 years, and then 15 years, and showing how the vegetation on here changes. It might just sit here in a fairly steady state and not change at all. Or it might change radically, if, for instance, they were to do major works on these roads, say the surface started to break down, decided to resurface them, and they use this as a temporary depot. That would wipe all of this out. Or they might change the management of this and say, yeah, let's turn the clock back a bit and see if we can get some heathland. Because this bit here, and those bits over there, even though they're separated by all this tarmac, and those bits over there, and that bit under the trees, and the bits at the end of this cul-de-sac, could add up to quite a large area. And it might be something nice. But would that reduce the house prices? Would that adversely affect the value of the houses around here? It's a question, isn't it? It's a question you've got to ask. So with that thought, I'm going to leave you. Hope this has made a video. I hope it's not been too rambly. I hope it's given you something to think about.